my name is Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the battleground. This week, we're talking about two progressive leaders who are making a splash on both sides of the Atlantic. Zohran Mamdani has become a kingmaker in New York politics, while Zack Polanski has seemingly revitalized the British left. And it's important to ask, how do we understand these two progressive figures on each side of the pond? And joining me in this discussion is my co-host, Mitchell Plitnick.
Hi, Josh. So, Mamdani over here I'll tell you, as a native New Yorker, is making me really wish I lived back in my hometown. He's an inspiring leader. He's an excellent speaker, really good politician, and he's had a good deal of success despite pretty overwhelming odds in his first few months as mayor of New York. So he's been successful in balancing the budget. He's been successful in getting a rent freeze. He's been successful in starting some of the projects that he campaigned on. He's been less successful with some of the other things, but of course, in 6 months, and some of the things he promised are very big. You really can't expect everything to go all the way that it should. I think one of the things that happens with Mamdani is that people, and he to some extent brought this upon himself. People expect so much from him because he promised a lot. There are things that he is not entirely in control of. One of the things he promised was free buses, but the New York City mayor doesn't actually control the bus lines. That's part of the statewide transit system. The governor has quite a bit, it has quite a bit to say about that. So that's been difficult. He's talked about taxing billionaires, which again he needs the state of New York to actually help with. So some people look and say, well, he wasn't able to get that done. I mean, I think this is all nitpicky stuff, really, because Mamdani came in with with a bold agenda. He's managed to do a lot. His approval rating is through the roof in New York. I mean, it's almost 60%, which is practically unheard of in New York. With a disapproval rate that's well below 30. It tends to be the case that new mayors in New York poll well, not unusual for any public official, but he's done remarkably well and it has gone. His approval rating has gone way up. I think more than anything else, we're seeing a man who is good at running the city. He's actually a good administrator. He has pragmatic ideas, and I think that's what's kind of thrown a lot of the so-called centrists and moderates off their game. He is somebody who respects the idea of the office of being professional and actually being an administrator, which is something I think they didn't expect. So all of that has come together to really bolster not just Mamdani, but the political organization he's part of, the Democratic Socialists of America. And he has, he endorsed three people running for Congress in the recent Democratic primaries, all three in districts that the primaries are effectively the general election. And they all won. They all won by wider margins than they were expected to. One of them, Brad Lander, unseated a congressman who was Dan Goldman, who was pretty powerful, pretty influential, and had made a name for himself in being one of the lead prosecutors for Donald Trump's impeachment trial. So that he's done a lot. He's already seen as a kingmaker in New York politics, as you mentioned. He's seen as a kingmaker now, even in national politics in many ways. His endorsement in other races means quite a bit. So there's a lot happening here that actually speaks to how Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, is building momentum and really putting a real scare into mainstream democratic politics, so much so that they are changing even what the centrist Democrats are saying on matters like, for example, Israel, um, where Mamdani and other members of the DSA have really led the party to reject the blank check given to Israel, and have made that stick well enough that a lot of centrist Democrats are now trying to distance themselves at least from the most hardline pro-Israel politics, like groups like the lobbying group APAC. So it's been really pretty dramatic. There's a great deal of potential here. Unfortunately, given the politics of the United States, there's also a lot of ways that it can be derailed. But I certainly see some serious parallels between what Mamdani is doing in American politics broadly and what we've seen Zack Polanski doing in the UK.
Yeah, definitely that parallel is very visible from this side of the pond as well. Not least because Polanski is a kind of city figure who's gone national. He is a London Assembly official, which is a kind of mini parliament for London, kind of holding the mayor's office accountable in theory. He isn't a member of parliament, which, like Mamdani, means that he has a different role structurally in our politics, arguably a more advantageous role in that he stands outside the House of Commons and can actually say things that other politicians probably can't inside it, at least arguably. And it's part of a longer story of how the Greens have transformed in recent decades, but particularly over the last few years since they entered Parliament. If you go back 15 years, they had just one MP in Brighton, Caroline Lucas, and now they have about 5 MPs. And they have hundreds of councillors up and down the land in local governments all across England and Wales. And they've changed from being a kind of soft liberal or libertarian left party of the environmental movement with origins in, ironically, quite conservative politics, Malthusianism, if you go back to the 70s, to being what is a kind of radical left populist party, at least in its leadership. And these are still early days, given that Polanski has only been Green leader since, I think, autumn last year, I think September, if I'm not mistaken. So he's barely a year in, and yet he has kind of transformed the fortunes of the party. They've become a much more bigger profile party in the media. They won the Gorton and Denton by-election earlier this year, which was a major breakthrough for them. They ran a working class candidate, a woman who is a plumber in her career and training to be a plasterer. This was kind of attacked from the right. They tried to debunk it immediately and make out that she was actually completely fake kind of middle class figure who was actually like secretly part of the elite and so on. It was quite a bizarre attack on her character, which failed miserably actually in that campaign. And soon after her victory, Reform and the right-wing media pivoted to attacking the voters of Gorton and Denton, making out that it was a kind of sectarian Islamic coalition that brought Hannah Spencer into Parliament, which is, again, something that we're going to come back to, but is a big part of this story, is the way in which these politicians are treated in right-wing discourse, the way that they're not taken seriously, and the way that they're demonized, frankly, is a big part of this analogy.
Yeah, I mean that certainly happens here with the DSA, and with Mamdani in particular. But I think and we'll certainly get to the sort of far right and how Tories or Reform in the UK and Republicans here are dealing with these progressive, if you want to call them uprisings. But I think what's to me, at least at the moment, of more immediate interest is how these sort of established centrists, the so-called moderates of parties like Labor in the UK and the Democrats here in the United States, are responding to to these figures, because the attacks on progressive candidates by moderate Democrats here in the U.S. have been vicious and very disingenuous, I have to say. Um, Ironically, one of the things that they like to say about the DSA is that their support isn't coming from working class people, which, first of all, depends on how you define the working class. They say it's actually, middle class people. Well, middle class is working class by any reasonable definition of that term, but they're not entirely wrong in saying that most of the, you know, low wage workers in this country are still not flocking to DSA. The thing that they're not mentioning is they're not flocking, they're flocking even less, or attracted even less to these moderate Democrats. And in fact, it's the moderate Democrats that chase them away, that repeatedly refuse to deliver for them, and therefore made them more open to the right wing populist rhetoric, the anti-elitism, the phony anti-elitism of the Republican Party. That's what the DSA is trying to overcome, and the Democrats are attacking the DSA for not overcoming the problem that they created yet. And I think "yet" is the key word. I think working people in this country are skeptical of the DSA, and because they're skeptical of Democrats in general. They're skeptical of centrists and leftists in general, because what they have been told is the left has been the Democratic Party, and that party has abandoned them. Uh, that party basically threw them to the wind a long time ago, saying, "What are you going to do? Vote for Republicans?" And their answer was, "Yeah, we're going to vote for Republicans." And the DSA is trying very hard to get them back, and that fight has only just begun. But I think this is one of the things that we're seeing happening in New York, because what's happening in New York is Mamdani is starting to deliver for working class people. He is starting to attack the problem of rising prices, rising housing costs. There's a long way to go, and there's many obstacles to overcome. And I'm not sure Mamdani can overcome them just as mayor of New York. I mean, there's much wider structural changes that will have to happen for any city to overcome those problems. Um, and I suspect that this is true in the UK as well, that there's just a skepticism after years of being told by Labour some similar things. We're going to fight for the working class. You elect a Keir Starmer, he turns around and immediately cuts off funding for pensioners. I mean, it seems to me a very strong parallel, and on some level, the hypocrisy will, I think, catch up with these mainstream centrist legacy, whatever you want to call them, Democrats, who are playing this game, and trying to demonize the left for the sins that they themselves committed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's no coincidence that the Greens are surging under a Labour government. And that's, again, a really important point of comparison here. But it is also complicated by the fact that the DSA is obviously within the Democrats still, whereas the Greens are very much an independent party with its own history and internal culture and politics. And the disillusionment with Labour is playing out in a different way, insofar as the Greens are almost a kind of what would be the phrase, like a repository, or a kind of an absorbing agent, as it were, of disillusionment. They're soaking up progressive disenchantment, in a sense, with the Labour Party, which historically has had nowhere to go in our electoral system. And that has been, as you've alluded to in the US, has been a crucial part of the kind of extreme centrist strategy of basically saying to a whole bunch of voters, you have nowhere to go, so you have to put up with us. Or it's the Conservatives or it's the Republicans, and you really hate those guys. So you've got to suck it up. Well, Polanski and Mamdani have said to voters, you don't have to suck it up. Actually, there's a different way of approaching the situation, and lo and behold, many voters are open to that. Of course, it is, as you've said, not the case that there is this kind of huge surge playing out, but there is a surge of a kind. Um, Most working class people on both sides of the pond, as we say, are still pretty skeptical of mainstream politics at this point and pretty disaffected. The advantage that the Greens have over any Democrats, I suspect, is that they are genuinely novel in our political system right now.
There's an aspect of that, I would say, in the DSA.
Mm.
The fact that Bernie Sanders stood out for years in saying that he was a democratic socialist. The argument had been, and it was a bogus argument all along, that the word socialism was going to scare away voters, so don't vote for Bernie Sanders, because if he's representing the Democrats, we're going to lose because of this scary word socialism. It was never true. At least when I say never, I mean at least in the last 15, 20 years. I think if you go back to the Cold War, it might have been true. But now it has not been true, as many of us, including myself, argued at the time. And I think now it's been proven, and for the most part, they've dropped that argument among Democrats. Republicans are still using it. It's not been very effective because people are looking at the policies, right? So in that sense, I think the Democratic Socialists have brought something new. But in essence, they're really advocating policies that used to be part of the mainstream of the Democratic Party here in the States. If you look back to the New Deal, just heading into World War II, and how that was actualized, and how it was seen by its instigator, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Look at the principles that he was trying to instill, and look at the policies that he supported. Policies that were so popular that even some of them even got echoed by the Republican president Dwight Eisenhower, a guy who made his political bones by being one of the top generals in the army, and was clearly conservative. He was the Republican. He was from the Republican Party. These ideas that people should be able to have a place to live, that people should have health care, that people should have an education, that is the government's job to make sure people get that. These are not radical ideas in most of the world. They were not radical ideas to FDR. If you look at his what he wrote this almost at the end of his life, his second here economic bill of rights. Most of these principles are what we talk about now in terms of democratic socialism. This is what they are. And many of them are things that we've seen enacted in different parts of Europe, particularly in Scandinavia, but also even in other parts of Europe, like the UK. When we look at the National Health Service, for an example, when it used to function a little better. So this is not something from another planet, right? These are innovations in terms of what we think about today in the United States. But that's because Americans don't know history and forget the fact that these were very, very mainstream ideas. Just 70 years ago, they were not revolutionary. And similarly to what we have now, they were attacked by a far right, anti-communist, what we call McCarthyist movement at that time. So you had these sort of poles fighting back then, much as you do now. And we'll see how it comes out. What worries me more is what happened in the UK to Labour when with Jeremy Corbyn, and how various issues, but most prominently anti-Semitism, was weaponized to bring down not just Corbyn himself, but entire left and we've discussed this in
Yeah.
previous podcasts, but I think it really bears looking at here in this context because Mamdani has become the face of the DSA, and he is Muslim. You have Zack Polanski leading the Greens, who's Jewish, yet um, similar accusations have gone his way because of course and in a in one of the more twisted developments of uh, at least from my perspective as a Jew of history, anti-Semitism has become defined as being opposed to the policies of the state of Israel. So we're going. I think we're going to see some of this happening. We've already seen Mamdani overcome this to become mayor of the city with the highest Jewish population outside of Israel, um, and with a whole bunch of Jewish support. Not to mention,
Mm.
very vocal Jewish opposition as well. But that reality doesn't change anything, much as Polanski being Jewish doesn't seem to change it for the Greens.
Yeah, there's a very interesting parallel here because, uh, well, as you've already pointed out, Polanski is a Jewish British guy, and Mamdani is a Muslim American. Um, Mamdani is breaking through in a city which has the largest Jewish population outside Israel, I think, and Polanski in the UK has built a coalition, a working class coalition, which includes a Muslim working class base. It's often overplayed the extent to which the Greens have a Muslim base. It's a big chunk of the coalition, but it's not the only part. There is a kind of interesting comparison there. The fact that Polanski is Jewish hasn't helped him when it comes to accusations and innuendo about his character, when it comes to anti-Semitism and suggestions that he's an anti-Semite or in some way in hoc to anti-Semites or Islamists. Again, the use of the term Islamist in British politics, and this is probably true in the US as well, is now just basically a synonym for Muslims in public. It's just Muslims in public life, and that includes Polanski's own political allies, such as Mohsin Ali, who is his deputy, who is widely vilified as if he's some sort of, I don't know, Al Qaeda operative, when in fact he's just a Muslim man who believes in class politics, believes in environmental politics, and has a strong moral position on Gaza, naturally, as many people do in the UK. And again, in both cases, I think there is a political shift underway over Israel and Palestine, and it's playing out in different ways. But both figures, I think, represent that shift.
I find this really interesting because it's kind of a mirror, right? You have Mamdani is attacked as an anti-Semite. He's Muslim. Uh, Polanski gets attacked, but he is a Muslim with a lot of Jews in his camp. Mamdani has been supported by significant portions of the Jewish community, the progressive Jewish community, Jewish Voice of Peace, and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and other Jewish groups that are largely headquartered in New York, have been very strong in their support of Mamdani, and that's been visible. The Jewish support of Mamdani has been visible. We've seen that Mamdani in polls very well among younger Jews in New York, even Jews who are not necessarily affiliated with groups like JVP and JFRED. Similarly, and the reflection is Polanski, who's Jewish, but as you say, has a strong base of Muslim support, uh, and all of this comes back to this bizarre definition of what anti-Semitism is and the way it's being mobilized. And it's not only anti-Semitism; it's also the way anti-Semitism, the false definition of anti-Semitism is interwoven with very real Islamophobia,
Yeah.
right? The We've seen this, we're seeing this with a DSA candidate in Michigan, um, Abdul Sayad, who is running for the Senate against the APAC candidate Haley Stevens, and they're basically neck and neck right now in the polls. And the innuendo, no one's saying he's an evil Muslim. I mean, this is a Democratic primary. They're not about to go out and say he's a evil Muslim terrorist of Al Qaeda or something like that. But there's a lot of innuendo. They have attacked him using familiar Islamophobic tropes about misogyny. They've 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 implied anti-Semitism. They've certainly attacked him on his stance on Israel and Palestine, which is pretty straightforward anti-Zionist, much like Mamdani's was, and we saw what effect that had. Now the question is, can El Sayed weather those accusations in a statewide vote, which is a very different thing from a city here in the United States? As in most places, relative left-wing, progressive, liberal, etc. sentiment tends to be concentrated in the cities much more than in suburbs to some extent, and certainly rural areas. And you have to contend with all of that in a statewide election in a way you don't have to in a citywide one. So we will see how that comes out. And it could very well be that El Sayed could lose. He could also win the nomination and lose to the Republican. Michigan is a very divided state in terms of Republican Democrat. And indeed, if that happens, I'm sure that we will all hear about how it's because of his socialist politics, his anti-Israel politics, et cetera, et cetera. So that's always kind of there in the background. But it is magnified by the fact that El Sayed is Muslim, and that has been used, I think, in subtle, less than subtle ways, in his campaign and in other campaigns we've seen recently in New Jersey, where Adam Hamawi won the Democratic nomination for Congress, and other races where Muslims have started to assert themselves as American citizens, as well they should. And we know what kind of backlash that can bring, but it has to happen. It has to happen, and we cannot, in the same way, for all the reasons that I may have opposed Kamala Harris, or I may have opposed Hillary Clinton, the one I was not going to listen to is the argument that said, well, they're women, and therefore there's going to be this anti-woman vote that could get Trump into office. And said, you know what? If that's what happens, we have to face that. That is not a valid argument as to why to not support them, even if it's true. And I think it is true. I think it is in this country true that there's a reason we have never elected a woman president, which so many other countries, most other I don't want to say civilized, even countries around the world in all sorts of places, whether whether it's Europe. We can look at Israel, we can look at India, we can look at many places in the global South where women have been elected. And somehow in the United States, we don't. And so it is real, but I don't care. That's not a valid reason to not vote for them. And it's not a valid reason to not vote for a Muslim, in my view. But it's certainly one that is mobilized here in the US. And that sort of Islamophobia is very much entangled with these false definitions of anti-Semitism. I suspect that the Greens are experiencing something similar.
Yes, they are, and it's entwined with Islamophobia and also a strange resurgence of genuine anti-Semitism in a fairly peculiar way. On the one hand, you have insinuations about Polanski and the Green left, of course, that they're in some way tainted by anti-Semitism. At the same time, there's an overdrive of kind of Islamophobic narratives about the base and how they're supposedly sectarians and supposedly ethnic politics and all of this kind of thing. Clan politics, family voting, all of which has been thoroughly debunked, but are part of the tropes of this kind of vilification. Where anti-Semitism comes back into it in a genuine way is that ironically, it seems that the caricaturists of the British press, without naming anyone specifically, can't seem to draw Polanski in any way that isn't quite similar to a 1930s anti-Semitic caricature. And likewise, there are right-wing insinuations and suggestions about Polanski's character, about, in particular, the way he changed his name as a teenager. That's always picked up as somehow a suggestion that there's a kind of secret identity or some kind of dual agenda, that kind of thing. You'll often hear right-wingers describing him as creepy, and you won't be able to get to quite what they're talking about, but they'll just say, "Oh no, there's something about him." You could read a lot into all of that stuff, and it's no accident that anti-Semitism, in a genuine political sense, is back on the right, unfortunately. And yet, all we hear about is anti-Semitism on the left.
Yeah, we have the same thing happening here, which is very bizarre. Of course, we have the Anti-Defamation League, which is fueling that. I mean, they just in every way possible, throwing gasoline on this fire of anti-Semitism, making it so much worse every single day by defining it simply as being opposed to genocide, being opposed to apartheid, instead of the very real right-wing anti-Semitism that is developing here. So and this came, this kind of connects into this sort of last point I wanted us to get to, which is another mirror image that I see of factors that could derail the rise of Mamdani here and Polanski over there. Over here, we've seen the very, very dramatic fall of Graham Plattner, a candidate I will say up front I supported until his most recent allegations. I never argued that he wasn't very fundamentally flawed, but his politics were good. He has now been very credibly accused of sexual assault. He has not yet dropped out of the race, which I think is unfortunate. He needs to do that as fast as possible. So hopefully progressives can move to get somebody with similar politics and better character in to replace him. But he is inevitably associated with the progressive movement, even though he's actually not DSA. In fact, he explicitly distanced himself early in his own campaign from DSA. He says he's a capitalist. He does not support socialism. He does not agree with all of DSA's policies, et cetera, et cetera. He certainly was never a part of it. Ironically, we're now seeing, though, him being, the DSA and that whole movement sort of being vilified, first by Republicans, which is a joke. I mean, when to vilify DSA over Plattner, when you have got Donald Trump, who has been, Plattner is accused, incredibly accused. I mean, I'm not minimizing in any way the accusation.
Of course.
Trump has been found liable in a court of law for rape. Okay, it's a little different. And yet Republicans elected him twice and nominated him 3 times. I don't want to hear from them. We can go through a whole list of Republican scandals from Matt Gaetz, George Santos. I mean, a lot of these people. One of the more bizarre things I've seen is again with the mainstream Democrats, a woman who is just really just the bane of, she's the best thing that ever happened to Trump, because she is probably one of the biggest reasons he has gotten elected twice. Her name is Neera Tanden. She's a major Democratic strategist and operative. She runs the Center for American Progress here. And she was just started dunking on DSA, talking about how, and I saw this one tweet from her this morning saying, well, one thing about the establishment is we vet our candidates. And I responded, I was like, really? She worked for Bill Clinton. Again, far more credible evidence that he was guilty of sexual assault. We know that he did some very improper things. Andrew Cuomo, Eric Swalwell was somebody she very actively supported. He was on the way to becoming governor of California until he had to quit the race in absolute disgrace when 5 different women talked about how he drugged and raped them. There was several more I listed in terms of this level of hypocrisy is ridiculous, especially because the progressives wanted to give, it's true, wanted to give Plattner a chance to be a different person, and he clearly abused that desire. And as soon as it became clear that that's what he did, everyone deserted him.
Mm.
Everyone who supported him withdrew their support. So that's being used here to discredit DSA, even though he had nothing to do with DSA. And I think it's a mirror image of something you mentioned to me earlier today, about how Andy Burnham, now standing potentially to replace Keir Starmer, could be bleeding support away from Polanski. So, whereas here it's this sort of negative attack, I think, using one political figure against another, even though they're not on necessarily the same page. In the UK, it's a political figure, I guess, in a relatively positive, or at least potentially positive sense, possibly bleeding that support away.
Yeah, Burnham is definitely bad news for Polanski, I think, at this point. That may change in coming months, and it may well change over the next couple of years by the next election. I'll just touch on a key point about all of this, that although there isn't a kind of direct analogy in the sense of a sexual abuse angle here, there is the connection to the Epstein scandal insofar as Peter Mandelson's friendship with Epstein helped bring down Starmer ultimately. And that is partly why we now have a new Labour leader in waiting, effectively. What I'll add to that is that this is bad news for Polanski, because Burnham is soaking up a kind of progressive disenchantment with Starmer within Labour itself, which does kind of stem the kind of flow of centre-left and left-wing voters away from Labour to the Greens. The big test will be whether or not he can kind of reconsolidate voters that have already gone over to the Greens, which may prove to be more difficult, but it's not impossible. Again, a lot of those people were Labour people until quite recently. And if he plays his cards very well, Polanski may be outmaneuvered quite quickly. But it's still the case that the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, is still the same party as it was a year ago. It is a party composed of MPs selected by Mandelson. Again, a point that isn't stressed enough in all of this, in this strange saga of Starmerism. So from Polanski's point of view, he just has to keep fighting from the left. And that's certainly the best strategy for him. The Greens may be losing momentum for now, but they could easily bounce back, especially if Burnham fails.
Yeah, I think it's a rocky road ahead, but I do feel like there's a lot more potential now in both our countries for a progressive surge, a progressive turn in our politics, because I think so many more people have realized the failure of both the right and the so-called centrist, which I actually think is more center right, but all of those kind of politics. And I think they're finally ready to give real progressive politics a chance. We'll have plenty more to discuss.
That we will. There is some hope in all of this, at least.
Yep.
And on that note, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening. This has been Globalists.